Peter S. Goodman is a global economics correspondent for the New York Times and author of the fascinating new book, Davos Man, How Billionaires Devoured the World. Peter, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thanks so much for having me.
So who or what is Davos Man?
Well, Davos Man is a term that was coined by the political scientist Samuel Huntington back in 2004, and he was using it to refer to people who go to Davos, Switzerland for the annual gathering of the World Economic Forum. This is at least front-facing, earnest, somewhat academic partnership between government and business around solving the biggest problems in the world. I mean, their mantra is committed to improving the state of the world. It's become a required stop on the circuit of venues for the richest people on earth. Now, there's hangers on like Hollywood movie stars. I mean, you see people like Matt Damon wandering around. I once ran into Peter Gabriel and had dinner and heard about how he was making music with chimpanzees. But the term Davos Man, I use it to refer to like this sort of separate species of human that's so powerful and their wealth so complicated, stretching across jurisdictions that they need legions of accountants in every country, tax experts, lobbyists to do their business. And they really don't feel any sort of allegiance to anything but the bottom line. And most important, they've positioned themselves as our savior. They pursue these sort of win-win solutions to everything, which is another way of arguing that no one, especially not Davos Man, has to sacrifice. And this is a kind of prophylactic against redistribution of wealth or a change to the status quo.
Yeah, and in climate circles, the Koch brothers are probably the most vilified billionaires. We've done plenty of podcasts on them. They're not even mentioned in your book. Instead, you focus on Jamie Dimon, Jeff Bezos, Mark Benioff, Larry Fink, and Jim Schwartzman. Why did you want to focus on those five?
Well, I could have focused on just about anybody. I mean, anybody who goes to Davos as a billionaire probably would have done the trick. These are people I've watched over the years. Now, Fink, I think for your purposes, is especially important. The Koch brothers, certainly they're hugely important, right? I mean, you can't think about climate change without thinking about the Koch brothers. You can't think about global capitalism without thinking about the Koch brothers. First of all, they've been written about a lot. Secondly, their machinations are more like, funneling ideas through compliant think tanks, using lobbyists to manipulate Congress. They don't do so much of this, like, look at us, we're the good guys. They're content to work behind the scenes. Whereas take somebody like Larry Fink. So here is the world's largest asset manager. His company, BlackRock, manages in excess of $10 trillion. So anything he says, anything he actually does, has the potential to alter flows of capital. And he releases this annual shareholder letter where he celebrates himself as a force of progress, specifically on climate change, right? He's gotten a lot of ink from a lot of people in my business over the years as this guy who's supposedly delivering a wake-up call to all of industry. If you don't retrofit your operations, if you don't change the way your companies are organized to deal with climate change, then you will be punished by the marketplace. And implicit in that is I can do some punishing because, if I actually got active on shareholder votes and took an active role in determining who runs your companies, I could, have a lot to say. But the truth is, and this is why he's such a good Davos man for my book, it's really talk. I mean, Davos Man is great at talk, is great at manifestos. I mean, Fink is a driving force behind the Business Roundtable back in the summer of 29, releasing this new statement of a purpose of a corporation behind this notion that he has really championed called stakeholder capitalism. Forget Milton Friedman, they say. That's ancient history. Now business is part of the solution to all of life's problems, and they're going to deal with stakeholders, labor, the environment, local communities. Another guy who's championed to this, who's in my book, is Mark Benioff, who's the CEO Salesforce, a big Silicon Valley technology firm. And he actually said at Davos, virtual Davos last year, CEOs are the heroes of the pandemic. He wasn't talking about frontline medical workers. He wasn't talking about parents dealing with kids stuck at home, contending with distance learning. CEOs, and he specifically said, government didn't save you. Non-governmental organization didn't save you. We saved you. We gave you vaccines. We gave you credit to spare you from bankruptcy. And we did all this not for profit, but to save the world. So these guys typify the mindset that I really want to get at, because while we may all hear these sorts of quotes and say, well, that seems preposterous, that's self-aggrandizement, we can look at what Fink has actually done. I mean, Fink is delivering $15 billion in capital to Saudi Aramco to expand natural gas pipelines. His company owns huge stakes of JBS, the giant Brazilian meat packer that's clear cutting the Amazon. So we can look at these details and say, well, okay, this looks like PR. But if we look at how they actually use this kind of rhetoric to position themselves as the good guys, and I think even benefit from the state of Texas, criticizing Larry Fink for supposedly being woke, in even threatening to use shareholder votes to deprive fossil fuel companies of capital. They've positioned themselves to win either way, which is different really from the Koch brothers. We're not supposed to see the Koch brothers as like the solution to our problems. We're not supposed to see them at all while they perpetuate the status quo. We're supposed to want Larry Fink and Mark Benioff to run the world and to believe in their innate goodness, which is something they use to enable the status quo themselves.
Yeah, there's so much hypocrisy coming from Davos Man, but possibly the most egregious example of this was their acceptance of Trump. Trump espoused, the exact opposite of all the things that they said they stood for, at least the forum, supposedly stood for. So why was he so welcome with open arms at the World Economic Forum?
Well, that's a great question. I was at the World Economic Forum at Davos in January of 2018 when Trump shows up, fresh from having scattered $1.5 trillion in tax cuts on the American public. But guess what? Most of those dollars landing in the pockets of people like Larry Fink and Steve Schwarzman and Mark Benioff. And it was interesting because, it really exposed how Davos and the forum are like these elaborate charades that allow Davos Man to virtue signal while, again, he really reinforces the status quo. Because, as I say in the book, Trump showing up at Davos, Trump is supposed to be this wrecking ball aimed at the liberal democratic order. He's yanked the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord. He doesn't believe in international cooperation, thinks that's the province of suckers, think globalization, never mind that the U.S. is the biggest beneficiary of globalization, is like this plot to deprive Americans of wealth. So he shows up at Davos with his well-known record for misogyny, playing footsie with white supremacists, racist depictions of all sorts of American communities. And Davos Man is supposed to be horrified. I say this is like the leader of a barbecue chain, a topless barbecue chain, showing up at a pious gathering of Talmudic scholars. But the truth is, some people at Davos were horrified, like the people who were supposed to think of as the real Davos. There are all these African diplomats who are, I'm not sure if I can say this statement on your podcast, but let's remember Trump has recently written off Africa as a bunch of shithole countries. They're not happy to see him. The non-governmental organizations that are actively dealing with climate change for real are not happy. But the people paying the bills, there are multiple Davoses, right? There's the earnest slate of panel discussions on climate change, gender imbalance, corporate governance. The real Davos people, the people paying the bills, will tell you with this sort of like jaded cool kids thing. Oh, they don't even show up at any of those. They've never even set foot in the conference center. They're hanging out at the banquets underwritten by global consulting companies, by global banks. They'll go, maybe they'll go into the conference center to go, and I'm not making this up, this real example, they'll go engage in a a simulation of the Syrian refugee experience. Well, they'll submit to being blindfolded and have people screaming at them in a language they don't understand, demanding their papers. And then they'll congratulate themselves for their empathy. And then they'll go off, to have truffles and caviar underwritten by HSBC in some banquet house, off the main drag of Davos. So like those people looked at Trump arriving and said, hey, we get it. This guy can say whatever he wants. Talk's talk. We get that because we'll say whatever needs to be said. We're focused on what he does. And what he had just done is shower the largest tax cuts they could have ever imagined on them, along with deregulation. So straight on through, Davos Man would have a lot to say about multi-stakeholder dialogues and climate change. But really, Davos Man likes to count the money landing at his account, and Trump delivered in spades.
Yeah, it comes down to the tax cuts, and that's so much about what your book is about. So what's happened over the last 40 years in regards to taxes for the richest people in the world?
Well, essentially, the richest people in the world have used their money to buy government. They've unleashed legions of lobbyists and accountants and lawyers to eviscerate labor protections and make it difficult for labor unions to organize, which means that American labor can no longer count on receiving the gains of productivity. Larger and larger mergers have been permitted, which has brought back monopoly power. And the most important thing of all is Davos Man has rewritten the tax code, has protected himself from potential closure of loopholes, has pioneered new ones. And the result of this is this cosmic transfer of wealth from the bottom up, such that many of these people, if not all of them, are paying smaller slices of their income to Uncle Sam than the people who are scrubbing their toilets.
Yeah, and you argue that these drastic cuts in taxes have then led to cuts in social spending, which has led to the far right movement's popularity growing across the world. So why is that?
Well, it's a template that we've seen again and again, and this is really how I started conceiving of the book. I was based in London at the time. I was spending a lot of time writing about Brexit. I was writing about Trump's trade war. I was spending time in Italy looking at the rise of the right. I was even seeing, in Sweden, the supposed bastion of social democracy, the Sweden Democrats, this fringe party forged in the neo-Nazi movement, suddenly is the third most popular party in the country. I mean, just shocking. And in each case, to one degree or another, we see this kind of nativist, tribalist aversion to immigration, a demonizing of the outsider, the other, fears of terrorism, if we're talking about Muslim immigrants. And in each case, if you dive down, and you don't have to go that far down, what you see is this kind of systematic pillaging of infrastructure. You see tax cuts that have dismantled social programs. I mean, in the UK, they have 10 years of nasty austerity following the global financial crisis. You have tax cuts for the wealthiest people. You have cuts to housing programs, to the National Health Service, to public transportation, to schools. I mean, life is downgraded for just about everybody. And the proceeds are transferred to the wealthiest people. And the result of that, and of course, it's a similar story in the US over decades, is you have lots of people who are furious. I mean, there's rage, and that rage can play out in lots of different directions, but it lays the ground for political opportunists, whether we're talking about Trump or Brexit or Matteo Salvini in Italy or the rise of the Sweden Democrats, who capitalize on this rage. And they don't blame the people who are actually guilty of downgrading living standards. That's the people I call Davos Man. That's the billionaire class. They blame, Afghan refugees. They blame in the States, Central American and Mexican immigrants, or they blame China. And, China is obviously a major threat in some ways to the global trading system. And China's a complex issue. China's also an opportunity, but, increasingly a threat that we got to deal with. But, let's face it, American living standards haven't been downgraded because of China. they've been downgraded because of how we've organized our trading relationship with China and other countries. It's not Beijing that's to blame for the erosion of the American middle class. It's decisions made in boardrooms in New York, in Seattle, in the halls of Congress, in successive presidential administrations in Washington. So, the story that I've tried to tell here is to put the focus on the people who've actually done the pillaging and who've put us in this situation where we're at one another. In many societies, there's blame, recrimination, rage, anger, and it's very, very difficult to organize to meet any kind of challenges, but especially huge challenges like climate change, where obviously there are economic opportunities around addressing climate change, but some people are going to have to make immediate term sacrifices, and they have no reason to believe that anyone will be there to help them out if they give up the status quo. So you can connect Davos Man and his pillaging to our inability to deal with fundamental challenges like climate change.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to who is forced to make those sacrifices. You've got a great chapter in the book about France and Macron. And I want to focus on the yellow vest movement, because that was characterized by many people as the French public's push back against clean energy taxes, right? It was a gasoline tax. But you write in Davos Man that it was much more than that. So can you explain how Davos Man's power in France eventually led to the yellow vest movement?
Sure. So Macron is a wonderful example of what I call a Davos Man collaborator in the book. He's a guy who worked at Rothschild's as an investment banker. He looks great in a sleek suit. He spent his whole life cultivating rich people. He's friends with Bernard Arnault, who sometimes is the wealthiest person on earth. He's in the top three. He's the guy behind Louis Vuitton, Dom Perignon champagne. Spends a lot of time at his estates in the south of France, rhapsodizing about Chateau Yquem, the Sauterne that he actually owns, playing the piano and figuring out ways not to pay taxes. And he recognizes in his friend Bernard Macron, who had been the economics minister, this guy gets my language. Like, he's all about, let's make life a refuge for rich people in France. And he buys into what I call the cosmic lie, this idea that wealth will then trickle down, something that in real life has happened 0 times. And Macron benefits from Arnault and other rich people. He carefully cultivates them. He goes around to BNP Paribas, major investment bank, and gets funds raised for his presidential campaign from them. And his campaign is presented very carefully and effectively as this kind of popular upsurge, because both the right wing and the left wing are declining in popularity in that time. I mean, the establishment left just looks kind of ridiculous and they're lost. The right is split between Marine Le Pen's National Front and a bunch of other parties that can't coordinate. And so here comes Macron. He's boyish, he's handsome, he speaks English almost perfectly. He's talking about how France is no longer going to be hostile to business. And it's true that, there's this sort of unhelpful anti-business rhetoric that has dissuaded investment that actually would be productive for France. He's talking about something that nobody in France really spends enough time talking about, which is that there's this high rate of unemployment. But he pins it all, the solution, to making life comfortable for people like Bernard Arnault and other rich people, while he's also seeking the mantle of leadership on this really important issue of climate change, along with European integration. Brexit's happening. He presents himself as the guy who's going to revive France and therefore revive Europe as an important force for social change. But he twins this tax on gas with a reduction in the wealth tax. So, Paris is a modern city with a wonderful network of public transportation. People can rely on bike paths, on the metro, on buses, and they can get around. Most of France, this may shock Americans, is much more like the US. Like, people live in these little towns. They live in suburbia. They need their cars to get everywhere. And guess what? Well, we may be surprised to learn this in the US. Inequality is rising dramatically in France. And there are huge numbers of people who have seen a downgrading of social services while taxes are now falling for wealthy people. And they absorb this increase in the gas tax as Macron essentially sacrificing them, the needs of the vast majority of French people, to, make himself look good in Davos. One slogan has it, Macron is thinking about the end of the world, and we're thinking about the end of the month. And they recoil at this notion that he will be able to talk about the gas tax in places like Davos while they're stuck now spending more to get to work. And so the result is this dramatic, sustained outpouring of protest. People put on yellow vests, like yellow construction vests. This becomes the uniform of protest. And the protests explode such that Macron actually has to walk back the gas tax. And this exposes that huge numbers of people feel like they've been kicked out of their society. There is overlap, I discovered when I went and did reporting and hung out with the yellow vest, with the National Front, which is, of course, demonizing immigrants. And I was in one town, a small city called Bourges, a couple hours south of Paris, where I was hanging out with an encampment of yellow vests. And a bunch of people in there were complaining that, like, all of our wealth is going to these African immigrants. They've got beautiful shoes and the latest iPhones, and that's why we can't get any benefits. And one woman says, I should paint my face black and then I'll be able to get benefits. I actually went over and visited these guys. There were like 99 refugees waiting for their asylum claims from Africa, from Afghanistan. Man, if this is where all the French wealth went, they were keeping it well hidden, because they didn't have Wi-Fi that worked. They were trying to study French. They couldn't even take the bus to get into town. It was so far away. They were living on like 200 euros a month. This I think reveals how this systematic pillaging and this catering of policy to wealthy people lays the ground for the far right.
Yeah, the systematic pillaging of our economy, of capitalism, of our social services has really led us to where we are today. And I want to talk about the pandemic, because we've heard so many times that the COVID pandemic is analogous to, or maybe a preview of, what we should expect with the climate crisis. And, we're still living in this hell that is the COVID pandemic. So I think talking about this is going to help us, learn how Davos Man might treat the climate crisis. So how did billionaires make it harder for rich nations like America, like Italy, Sweden, make it harder for those countries to combat the pandemic?
Well, depends how far back you want to go. I think we got to look at healthcare, right? So in all those countries you just named, we saw privatization schemes in the cases of Italy and Sweden, and the UK for that matter, where larger and larger swaths of national healthcare were put in the hands of private operators who behaved like private entrepreneurs. They tried to make money. So in Italy, for instance, there was a cutting of basic healthcare in the province of Lombardy, which is Italy's wealthiest province. It's where a lot of high-end manufacturing has been. The financial center of Milan is in Lombardy. And their system just completely buckled during the pandemic. They were overwhelmed. And it wasn't simply, look, the pandemic would have challenged any healthcare system, right? This is the worst pandemic in a century. But you had a situation where you had literally just a handful of people who were capable of dealing with basic questions of public health, because Lombardy had followed these incentives to go into high-end lucrative specialties like, heart procedures, like certain kinds of cancer. And they were very well set up for those sorts of things. And family medicine had been downgraded so much that, I talked to a doctor in Milan who was shocked that she just didn't have time to even call her patients who had COVID, because she was just overloaded with people. I talked to a woman named Chiara Lapora, who's a doctor with Doctors Without Borders, MSF. This is a woman who spent her life in horrific conditions in places like Afghanistan, Cambodia, Yemen, conflict zones. And she was just shocked to discover that she and her MSF colleagues were needed in her home country of Italy. And they set up shop in Lombardy, where they discovered that the privatization had set up a system where nobody was really in charge, where she couldn't even get the various private providers of meal services, to limit their visits, to coordinate their visits, to limit exposure of the pandemic because they're afraid they'd be in breach of contract. In Sweden, we've seen a downgrading of care, especially for elderly people, in order to cover tax cuts for wealthy people. And as a result, there was essentially what one doctor told me was an illegal form of euthanasia. I mean, it wasn't official in that way, but it was effective, where the healthcare system, in order to prevent the healthcare system from being overloaded, anybody in a senior center who came down with COVID symptoms was just basically given morphine and left to die without even a doctor, in many cases, looking at people's symptoms. They were just assumed that, they had to be rationed out of healthcare. In the US, Steve Schwartzman's Blackstone, he's a character in my book. This is the world's largest private equity magnate, a guy worth $30 billion. In the run-up to the pandemic, he sinks $6 billion into an investment in a company called Team Health, which dominates staffing for emergency rooms. And this is part of a wave of investment that turns healthcare into a commodity, not unlike a seat on an airplane or a Big Mac at a McDonald's. They want pricing power. So this explains why in the decades running up to the pandemic, the US actually loses a third of its hospital rooms. The US becomes dependent upon just-in-time supply chain contracts for PPE, for medical gowns, for sanitizer, for face masks from providers in places like China, overwhelmingly China, because it's cheap, because a dollar that you spend warehousing PPE against a pandemic is a dollar that you can't pay out to the shareholder in the form of dividends. So, we have this diminution of healthcare. And then in the middle of the pandemic, there's a doctor whose story I tell in the book, a guy named Ming Lin, who's a decorated emergency room doc who had actually worked in New York, close to the World Trade Center on 9/11. So he's at this hospital in Bellingham, Washington, north of Seattle. And as the pandemic begins, he starts asking the hospital administrators, why are people still sitting, at the entryway without masks? Why do we have no triage system? Why are we continuing to have elective surgeries ongoing? And he's told repeatedly, like, well, we don't want to make the customer nervous with face masks. That's a bad look. He complains to Blackstone's Team Health, his employer, and he's told, well, the hospital's our client. We don't want to upset them. He eventually goes public, blows the whistle, and is fired. I mean, this guy is fired for warning that his hospital is making the US vulnerable to a pandemic that eventually kills hundreds of thousands of people. Again and again, we see the profit motive driven by Davos Man trump public health considerations. And then finally, let's look at vaccines. I mean, vaccines, we should all be grateful for vaccines, right? We should all be grateful that companies like Pfizer and Moderna gave us vaccines in record time. But we should have some say over how they distribute those vaccines, because they have essentially capitalized on publicly financed research, and they've taken this commodity and they've sold it around the world to the highest bidder. They have essentially prioritized returns for their shareholders over stopping the pandemic. And as a result of that, we now live in a world where there are frontline medical workers in parts of Africa and South Asia who are still treating COVID patients without any protection, while we're giving booster shots to children in the United States. And, if it's not enough that that's a humanitarian disaster, that's a disaster in the most selfish terms, because the Omicron variant is essentially, invited through this system. There were people warning a year ago, if we don't deal with inequitable distribution of vaccines, we will get variants. Here we are. We, the public, are effectively subsidizing the monopoly returns for companies like Pfizer through our shuttered schools and disruptions of our children's education, through our threats to livelihood, through death, hospitalization, fear. And Davos Man is especially skilled at giving us these false binaries that kind of insulate him from any accountability. It's as if we can either pick between Schwartzman dominating emergency services and Pfizer and Moderna collecting monopoly profits on vaccines, or we don't have any healthcare, we don't have any vaccines, we might as well be Venezuela, diving into dumpsters for our dinner. This is just a bogus idea that has been sold to us systematically by the people who are raking off the proceeds, and that has perpetuated and intensified the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean the parallels are they're so clear between the pandemic and the climate crisis. You've got this just relentless focus on cutting costs that has totally left us unprepared. And it's again,
Right.
the focus on profitability, on just jacking up prices keeps us from, investing in developing countries that need our financial support to develop the kind of clean energy infrastructure required for the kind of, economic growth that doesn't also destroy the planet like we've done for the last 200 years. I mean, based on what you've seen with the pandemic, do you have any doubt that Davos Man is going to use the climate crisis to further enrich himself as he has done throughout this pandemic?
Well, let me take care to say, I don't demonize business in this book. Some people may accuse me of that, but I don't. And I don't demonize, I don't dismiss the idea, that Larry Fink and Klaus Schwab, who's the head of the World Economic Forum, will celebrate that we got to have public-private partnerships. I'm all for public-private partnerships. I mean, I'm not sure I buy Fink's idea that, it would be terrible to threaten fossil fuel companies with divestment if they don't get with the program. I'm not sure that's very productive. But the premise of that, which is that people inside fossil fuel companies know more about the fossil fuel industry than everybody else, and therefore they should have a seat at the table to help us figure out how to do this. That seems perfectly sound. The question is, do we just accept that they have our best interests at heart and will deliver the solutions of their own accord without rules and incentives? And that just seems ridiculous, right? I mean, the markets could have a lot to say about climate change if we had, some kind of carbon trading system, if there was a price on pollution, then, the market system is pretty good at figuring out a good price. If there's rules and the costs and the benefits are transparent and you can actually have a market. But I think as currently constituted, there's a lot of branding around climate change and not a lot of action. And again, the fact that Larry Fink will write these letters every year celebrating himself as a hero for stakeholder capitalism, positing himself as a force for progressive change, while at the same time saying, well, actually, most of my funds are just passive funds, like they're S&P 500 index funds. I don't actually have any say over where the money goes. And by the way, I think it's good for my investors to be in Saudi Aramco and JBS. Like, it's pretty clear that the talk is talk and action is something else. But I'd also say, I think the thing that gives me the greatest pause, my greatest concern, if you look at the pandemic as a sort of portent for how we're going to deal with climate change going forward, is vaccine, not just vaccine distribution, but also vaccine acceptance in a country like the US, where we've monopolized the bounty. There are vaccines for everybody, and we've got huge numbers of people who won't even take them because we have so many crazy ideas about, oh, is this Bill Gates trying to put a computer chip in my body? Is this the government trying to take? These conspiracy theories take root because people have legitimate reasons to look at government and businesses and their leaders and say, well, I don't really know what's going on there, but I certainly know that my needs and the needs of my family don't seem to weigh all that heavily. And that, I think, is a serious problem. Let me just tell you briefly this story that has really stuck in my head that I tell briefly in the book. A few years ago, I went to Sweden to go visit this mining company where the truck drivers were threatened with job losses as this company was going to automate. And I talked to the truck drivers about this, or I talked to people at this mining operation in general. And I was really shocked as an American that they all said, yeah, we're fine with this. This is cool. No problem. If this makes our company more productive, then the company will make more money. and we'll end up with more wages. And if our particular job isn't needed anymore, well, that's fine. They'll train us for some other job. They weren't fearful. And that stayed with me because, in Sweden, as in most Nordic economies, their lived experience told them that that was actually true, that if the company's more productive, labor unions represent 70% of the employees. They sit down opposite employers associations for these wage negotiations, and it's understood by all that the gains of capitalism have to flow to the workers in a commensurate share. So therefore, they're willing to sacrifice. Well, in the States, where labor unions represent fewer than 10% of the workers, the labor unions are quite rationally just about like, no change. We don't accept any kind of change. We're gonna protect ourselves from the status quo. In the same way that the coal miner in West Virginia and their Senator Joe Manchin, they may be monkey wrenching change for the rest of us and threatening us with an existential risk in climate change, but they're not wrong to say, what I got. And if I give it up, I don't know what I'm going to get, because all around them are examples of people, in manufacturing jobs who get thrown out of work, who then have to work for half their pay at an Amazon warehouse, funneling more fortune to Jeff Bezos, or they got to go work emptying bedpans in a senior home. They got to do something that involves getting paid a lot less. It's a downgrading. And if they look at people like Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, declaring himself the hero in the middle of the pandemic, if they look at the fact that, Steve Schwartzman of Blackstone stays with Donald Trump until the bitter end because he wants tax cuts and deregulation, or even if they don't look at any of these things because they're too busy working 2 and 3 jobs, but they know in their gut, they can just look around like, I don't matter very much. My family's ability to hang on to my house does not matter very much to the people in charge. Then they're not irrational to say, I'm not sacrificing. Those guys aren't sacrificing. Why should I sacrifice? And boy, climate change, yeah, if we do it right, it's a tremendous economic opportunity. We could get a whole lot of jobs. But the coal miner in West Virginia has a good reason to be suspicious of this talk that somehow we're just going to snap our fingers and he's going to get trained to install solar panels in Arizona. That sounds like a fairy tale. And so long as we have that inequality, it's very difficult to get people to make the short-term sacrifices that we have to make to realize the longer-term benefits we're going to get, to say nothing of maybe just surviving, as a species in the face of this existential crisis.
Yeah, it's really, really hard to kind of buy into a system where, you lose your job during this pandemic and the ultra rich just become, unbelievably more rich. Jeff Bezos increased his wealth by nearly $100 billion during the pandemic by endangering employees and overcharging customers. Yet he is still treated like a hero, especially in a lot of parts of the media. When he used that wealth to launch himself and some celebrities into space. I mean, why do you think that the media and really a good chunk of Americans let these guys get away with this?
I think that they have very successfully sold this idea. And it's not just them, right? It's not just Bezos and Schwartzman Fink. It's like their forebears. Like over the last 70 years, they've sold this idea that big business is what's great about America. And by the way, that's true in a lot of ways, right? Like any great fairy tale, there's got to be some truth to it. Big business is really astonishingly successful. Jeff Bezos deserves props for revolutionizing e-commerce. He's clearly brilliant in terms of execution. All these guys are geniuses in some area, but they've sold this idea that if we then try to regulate them, if we try to tax them, if we try to take a look at their mergers critically through antitrust, or not just mergers, but the regular exercises of their business, then we might as well be Bolsheviks. We might as well be on the wrong side of the Cold War. And we love a good Horatio Alger story, and all these guys are capable of telling one. Bezos talks about the fact that his father's a Cuban immigrant. Steve Schwartzman will tell you that he worked in his dad's linen store in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and he still seems like a middle-class kid. Jamie Dimon, who's another character in my books, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, America's largest bank, will tell you that, you know, his grandfather came from Greece and they lived in Queens, the, you know, hard scrabble borough of New York. Never mind that Jamie Dimon has basically spent his entire life within an 8-square-block radius on Park Avenue, where he lives now, and where he went to an elite private boarding school where he wore a tie and a blue blazer every morning. I mean, these guys will fashion these stories that tap into this idea that they're self-made. And on some level, they are self-made, right? But they're self-made with the help of publicly financed infrastructure, research institutions that kick out innovation, graduates from publicly financed institutions that give them the people who can work in their companies, to say nothing of the roads and the internet itself. So they're part of society. And then, you know, in the pandemic, boy, this has been a huge branding opportunity for Davos Man as like this empathetic creature where we're all one. I mean, Benioff said in April of 2020, he went on Jim Cramer's show. He's a big fan of Jim Cramer's show. He said, I'm paraphrasing a bit, like, you know, the pandemic has brought home that we're really just one humanity, universally vulnerable to this virus. And this part I remember, it's erased the illusion of our borders. By the way, when I repeated this the other day, a Salesforce employee reached out to me on Twitter to point out that Salesforce actually does a lot of business with ICE, a company for whom borders are in no way illusory. And Benioff, you know, is speaking from his $28 million San Francisco Bayfront mansion, or maybe it's his place on the big island of Hawaii overlooking the ocean. I can't keep them apart. You know, this idea that, like, we've all experienced the pandemic collectively when there's, you know, a run on private islands, private jets, yachts. The billionaires are able to go wherever seems most favorable. When New York City public schools couldn't open because of a lack of tests, Steve Schwartzman was having dinner parties at his mansion in the Hamptons with lots of rapid tests for all. I mean, they're very skilled at living these incredibly privileged lives while telling this narrative where it's all made, which is kind of a wink, wink, like, hey, this could be you too, unless you let the Bolsheviks take over. And along the way, we are basically paying for their wealth.
Yeah, I mean, Bezos launched the $2 billion, climate commitment. Bill Gates has launched the Breakthrough Ventures. And you think about Elon Musk, he's got a car company that is undeniably, decarbonizing the auto industry. But all of these guys are problematic billionaires. You call the Davos Man an unusual predator whose power comes in part from his keen ability to adopt the guise of an ally. So why is it so dangerous for the public to see Davos Man as an ally?
Because we have essentially outsourced our democracy to these guys. We have allowed this idea that, ESG investing, Vanguard, one of Vanguard's largest exchange traded funds labeled ESG, Amazon, I mean, come on, right? And stakeholder capitalism, this idea that, we don't need, implicit in stakeholder capitalism is the idea that we don't need rules. We don't need labor unions. We don't need the government. Fink's shareholder letter this year was all about how, government needs to play a role. But BlackRock, like most publicly traded companies, is part of the Business Roundtable, which not only came up with the stakeholder capitalism pledge, but also lobbied centrally when it was headed by Jamie Dimon to deliver the Trump tax cuts. Government can't even function as a tax collector, let alone a spender of the revenue. And it's not by accident. And so these guys will starve the system of resources. Then they'll say, oh, the system is totally inept. Benioff again said, government didn't save you. Non-governmental organizations didn't save you. We saved you. The sum total of this is you're stuck with us, but lucky for you, we're good. And you shouldn't pay taxes because you're giving it to the people who can't do anything. Count on us for our philanthropy, for our forward-looking running of business. And that I think does have an effect in terms of persuading the public to accept a situation where lawmakers who are directly influenced by the donors that they're receiving from these Davos men are then accepting of, we don't need regulations. We need, voluntary compliance standards. I mean, this I've been writing about for 30 years in my career, going back to like water pollution in the Chesapeake Bay, when I was astonished to learn that like the entire state of Virginia had voluntary water pollution compliance standards in dealing with, Tyson, this giant meat packer that was dumping huge amounts of pollution into the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, if something's voluntary and there's multiple stakeholders, what we learn again and again is one stakeholder ends up getting VIP treatment, and that's the shareholder. And the shareholder is not in it necessarily for the long haul. It's a nice conversation to make the shareholder in it for the long haul. It's great that people like Fink are talking about that. That's great. But we, the people who actually are supposed to control democracy, need to have a say about what actually happens. And if we buy into stakeholder capitalism and Davos Man, looking out for all of us, not a predator, he's our benefactor, then we will fall victim again and again to something that we've now seen in real time. We'll be given trickle down as the solution to our problems. And the result of that will be a downgrading of public infrastructure, a downgrading of healthcare, a downgrading of public transportation, and more money landing in the bank accounts of Jeff Bezos, Larry Fink, and the rest of the Davos men.
In the last few chapters of the book, you dedicate to some possible solutions to reduce Davos Man's power over the world. In your opinion, if we're really going to be able to stop Davos Man from furthering, the climate crisis and basically every other crisis that we're facing today, what needs to be done? What can we do about this?
Well, we need a lot of information, right? There needs to be more transparency in markets. I mean, I think what we need to do is fairly straightforward and fairly simple, but extremely difficult to execute. I mean, we have to limit money in politics. We need progressive taxation. So, I mean, the longer term play is more people have to benefit from capitalism. And if the gains are spread more equitably and people who now have no stake in commercial life get a stake, then it's easier to have conversations around, who's going to sacrifice in the immediate term for the longer term gains. So we need progressive taxation, which then allows a financing of some kind of social safety net. That could be basic income. It could be a kind of jobs guarantee where the government promises a job for everyone, which doesn't actually mean that everyone goes to work for the government. Who wants to live in that world? But if at least that's guaranteed, that there's some basic job at a reasonable standard of living available in all times, then the private sector can do what it needs to do. Now, if we're going to live in a world where like people are going to work at Walmart and McDonald's and need food stamps just to get up in the morning so that they're fed, then there will be a lot of popularity in those government provided jobs, and that could force the major private sector employees to increase their game and pay people more. And when times are good, the government job bank would be a very lonely place. When times are not good, then there'd be at least this guarantee. But you can't even imagine doing something like that without progressive taxation, especially a wealth tax. I mean, we really need a wealth tax for the simple reason that that's where the money is. I mean, come back to Bezos. Bezos makes about $83,000 a year. That's his salary at Amazon. That's about what a public school teacher makes in California. So if we run a system where we depend upon income taxes, never mind that Davos Man has accountants and lobbyists and lawyers to game the system much better than the rest of us, Davos Man doesn't really have that much income. I mean, again, Bezos is making 83 grand a year, but he's worth 200 billion. The money is in his wealth. It's in his stock portfolio. And some people would say, well, why should we force him to pay taxes on, unrealized gains? Any of us who own a home are paying taxes on our unrealized gains. They're called property taxes. That's a very regressive form of wealth tax. We need a progressive wealth tax where if you're sitting on billions of dollars in wealth, that gets treated like actual wealth, and you pay. And you can talk about Elizabeth Warren's proposal, Bernie Sanders' proposal. There are others, and opponents will say, well, that hasn't worked in Europe. European countries have gotten out of wealth taxes, and there's some truth to that, but that's because they've tended to drop the threshold so low that, like, the classic, like, butcher's wife, now widow in Barcelona, who's been in the same apartment for 60 years because of the realization of the property market, now has to sell her apartment to pay the wealth taxes. Well, it's real simple. We just, make the line $1 billion, and then anybody below $1 billion doesn't have to sell anything. The other objection people have is, oh, it's too complicated. How can we value, wine cellars full of aged Bordeaux and Giacometti sculptures and private planes? These guys seem to be able to value stuff pretty well. I mean, that's Larry Fink and Steve Schwartzman's job. Moreover, I heard this wonderful proposal from a billionaire who's in favor of it, named Nick Hanauer, who said, look, if there's obviously there will be a gaming of the system, so give the government the right to come in if the level is set at an unreasonable level and demand an auction. So, if Jeff Bezos wants to tell us that his Maserati is only worth $50, then the government will say, fine, we're going to take that. We're going to auction it off. And if it gets more than $50, watch it driven away.
Yeah, I love that idea. Now, obviously, we don't have a wealth tax that hasn't been passed in the year that President Biden has been in office. But what has President Biden and his administration done to rein in the power of Davos Man?
Well, they tried, but it hasn't worked out very well. The stimulus that got passed early in Biden's time in office did expand unemployment benefits. That was helpful. There were credits that seem to now be sunsetting for children. There was a bolstering of the social safety net, but none of the tax stuff. I mean, Biden had wanted to increase corporate taxes. There was a brief flirtation with a wealth tax, though Biden is generally opposed to a wealth tax. There was some talk of some universal basic income like program by making the child tax credits permanent. None of that stuff has happened. And it reinforces that while, what I say is true, that the solutions to our problems are fairly simple, the execution is really very difficult. I mean, Davos Man is playing for keeps. Davos Man has not given up his privileges without a serious fight, and Davos Man has a tremendous apparatus at his disposal to fight off attempts to change the rules of the game.
And they haven't done this just in America. I mean, your book is filled with examples across different industries, across different countries, of the exploitation of employees, customers, suppliers, and obviously the planet in pursuit of these lower costs and greater profits. Do you think these widespread examples are indicative of an inherent problem with capitalism, or is this really just the doing of a tiny class of ultra rich?
That's a really important question. I mean, I, by and large, think that capitalism is the solution to our problems, but it's got to be real capitalism. I mean, what we've had isn't capitalism. What we've had is kind of corporate welfare for a handful of people who can craft every emergency rescue in their interest. They did that after the global financial crisis. They've done that again during the pandemic, where there's a focus on assets. And assets are overwhelmingly owned by a handful of billionaires, so they get most of the benefits. That's why, Oxfam tells us the world's 10 richest people have seen their wealth double since the pandemic began, while 99% of humanity has seen their income hit. What we've got is this kind of corporate welfare for these guys and then rugged individualism for everybody else. That's not going to work. Now, between 1945 in 1975 in the US, we had a kind of capitalism that was working pretty well. I don't have a fetish for those years. I don't want a time machine back to those years. We had Jim Crow. We had the Vietnam War. We had very serious and continuing examples of discrimination on race, on gender. But in one key regard, there was something important about those years, and that's that productivity gains, the gains in American capitalism, were actually transferred to working people, commensurate to the gains themselves. You had a system where, the old cliche, rising tide lifts all boats. The tide was rising and the boats really were rising. We got to get back to that. And that is not some sort of utopian, woolly headed fantasy. That's something that we already had. I mean, after the robber barons and the Gilded Age of the 1920s and tremendous monopoly power, and eventually the Great Depression, we got out of those experiences the New Deal, which brought progressive taxation. It brought a social safety net, Medicare, eventually Medicaid, the Social Security system. We got antitrust enforcement. I mean, we got the government actually looking out for other producers and consumers instead of just greenlighting anything that could be, somehow more efficient, which is supposed to be better for consumers, as if we should run the entire economy around what's best for consumers at one moment in time. We can do what needs to be done and keep the benefits of the market system. We can have Uber, we can have Google, we can have Bezos's fantastic e-commerce empire, we can have the internet. We don't have to go back in time. We just need rules, because capitalism simply doesn't work without a regulator, without some mechanism for making sure that the bounty is distributed in an equitable fashion. And if we don't have that, what we've already learned is we have rage, distrust, cynicism, and then we have a situation where people aren't taking vaccines in a pandemic. We have a situation where it's impossible to imagine grappling with serious challenges like climate change. We just can't keep going down that road. We need a capitalism that's grounded in a sense of societal interest, that's governed by society.
Yeah. If you want to understand why we're in the situation that we are in today, as far as politics, society, economics, climate crisis, all those things that you rattled off, check out Davos Man. It is a fantastic book. And in this conversation, we just scratched the surface. And I love the book, and I encourage everyone in our audience to go and get it. Peter, thank you so much for the work that you've done to bring awareness to this, absolutely critical issue. And thank you for joining the Climate Pod.
Oh, thank you for your excellent questions and putting the focus where it needs to go. I really appreciate your work.